I think for me, it was a change in my life when I became responsible for listening the stories, knowing that the stories of the worker, it was the story of hundreds of workers. Then when I began talking with community leaders about, do you know what is happening inside these poultry plants? What is happening inside all these companies? And people were like, oh, yes, we heard, we know, but we don't want to talk about it because it was this situation that people were advocating for the immigrants, but they didn't want to recognize that those immigrants were also poultry workers. And they divided the identity, like I care for the immigrants, but I don't really want to talk about the job that those immigrants are doing in Arkansas.
We're listening to The Underview, an exploration of the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we're going to continue a conversation that's been building quietly, but unmistakably throughout this season. Again and again, our guests have pointed to poultry. In episodes about civil rights and labor, about zoning and immigration, about corporate power and regional identity, this story has been there. Not always front and center, but it's never been absent. Behind the headlines and beneath the economic growth is an industry that has helped build Northwest Arkansas, and it continues to shape it in profound ways. And that brings us to the poultry plants, the need for low-wage labor, the dependency on immigrant workers, and the difficulty, sometimes the danger, of speaking up. We've heard about it in passing, we've had it named by community leaders and historians and policy experts, and at a certain point it became clear we couldn't tell the story of Northwest Arkansas without going straight into this. That is this episode. And I want to acknowledge something from the outset. This is a difficult conversation. It's one we don't often have in public. In fact, many in our community have a condition not to ask too many questions, because here in Northwest Arkansas, the poultry industry is foundational. It feeds our economy, it supports local nonprofits, it touches lives across class, culture, and geography, and yet the workers, the people whose hands keep the system running, are often invisible. So that's why I had to sit down with Magaly Licolli. Magaly is the co-founder and the Executive Director of Venceremos, a worker-led organization based in Springdale, Arkansas. She has spent years organizing alongside poultry workers in our region, many of them immigrants, who are seeking not just the better wages or safer working conditions, but something more fundamental: dignity, a voice, and belonging. Because that's really what's at stake here, our communal understanding of our belonging. Today's conversation is about understanding how we got here and who has been carrying the weight of our region's growth. It's about how capitalism, immigration, and labor policy have converged in Northwest Arkansas, and what it means to be a part of a community that depends on that convergence. Well, as you can see, we've got a whole lot to get through today. Let's get into it. Well, I have the privilege today of sharing the table with Magaly Licolli, who's the Executive Director for Venceremos, an organization here in Springdale, Arkansas that's working for advocacy for poultry workers here. And so, Magaly, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your table. Welcome to this conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to be in this work and maybe what the work of Venceremos does to help.
Yeah, I'm originally from Guanajuato, Mexico. I've been in this area for 20 years. I actually graduated from the University of Arkansas in 2012. And me being an immigrant from Mexico, I had the privilege actually to learn English as my second language and being able to go to the university. It was when I graduated from the university when I began working with the community in nonprofits. So in one of those jobs, I ended up working at the community clinic located in Springdale, Arkansas. And it is still a block far from one of the biggest Tyson's plants. And through that job, I was helping the patients to help them with resources and get them enrolled in any ways of healthcare. or any programs that the community offered. So a lot of those patients that go to the clinic are former poultry workers who can't find other jobs because of their injuries that they suffer working in these companies. And it was really shocking that to learn the lots of cases that the immigrants endured while working in these companies. I was able to meet with women that, for example, were exposed to chemical accidents at the plant and had holes in their lungs and were not able to find other jobs and were not even able to pay for their treatment. Many of those workers required more than $600 treatment per month and not being able to find other jobs because of their health situation. And to me, hearing those stories, it was shocking. But then hearing a story and similar stories, and it was just a point that it was not an isolated case. It was a systemic issue that the majority of the immigrants were all injured for life for having worked in the poultry plants. And to me, back then, it was like I get angry for listening the stories and frustrated because the clinic was not able to really support them fully because they required a very expensive treatment to live every day. And that's where I was interested in learning and how to organize workers, but I didn't have any idea of the labor rights or how to organize poultry workers, but I became responsible. I think for me, it was a change in my life when I became responsible for listening the stories. And I could not just take it as a job. Oh, I help you. And that's it. Knowing that the stories of those workers that I was able to hear, it was the story of hundreds of workers, dozens of workers that I could not meet when I was working there. And then every time that I left that job, I was like, I cannot believe this is happening. And talking to people, about what you mean this situation is happening every day and it's not alarming to everyone. Why I had to work in this job to be able to learn about these stories and then to learn that nobody really wanted to talk about these stories. So it was then when I began talking with community leaders about, do you know what is happening inside these poultry plants, what is happening inside the Tyson's plants, what is happening inside all these companies. And people were like, oh, yes, we heard, we know, but we don't want to talk about it because it was this situation that people were advocating for the immigrants, but they didn't want to recognize that those immigrants were also poultry workers. And they divided the identity, like I care for the immigrants, but I don't really want to talk about the job that those immigrants are doing in Arkansas. And all of these narratives going around in the town that were actually learned the power of these companies such Tyson and the power they had with the charity they were providing in the community to silence the community, to silence the workers' stories. It was a big motivation for me to do this job. And it was a big responsibility that I took, and I didn't really thought about how hard it would be. I was just really passionate about doing something about the situation because, growing in Mexico, I am from León, Guanajuato. León, Guanajuato is a city that is about 2 million people. But we also have extended family, or my family, part of my mom's side, are from Michoacán. Michoacán is another state. And I remember going to Michoacán every year, going to these towns every year. And suddenly I began seeing those towns getting empty because the people there began immigrating to the U.S. because they wanted a better life. So I grew up listening to stories of my own family or people immigrating to the U.S. for a better life. And we had this sense like in Mexico, oh, they are going there because they are going to get a better life. And when I heard the stories of the workers that immigrated from my own hometown, Guanajuato, it was like, no, this is not a better life. This is not what these people left their towns and families back in Mexico to find these jobs that are really humiliating them, who are violating their dignity, their humanity. And to me, that was a time that I said, this is not a better life for the immigrants, and we need to do something about this situation because these people or these companies are making themselves richer, whereas my community is now in this cycle of poverty because once they came to find these jobs and now they get injured for life and now depending on the resources the community provides to them, that is not a dignified life, right? That is not how we should end up in this country. And this is why I began doing this work.
I think you hit on something that I think is at the core of a lot of these conversations. And that's really the inherent dignity of the people that are a part of this community that deserve that dignity and deserve that respect just because they're a human being. If we start there, I would say I've lived in Northwest Arkansas for 40 years, and this is a community of people that's largely invisible from the broader cultural context sometimes. And I would love to understand from your perspective, if you can tell us a little bit more about this community of people that come here to work in these poultry plants and meat processing facilities. And I realize they're probably very diverse, but maybe help us understand, where do those stories begin and how do those stories bring them to Northwest Arkansas?
Yeah, the immigration in Arkansas really expanded because of the poultry jobs that they offer to the immigrants. And we really need to understand that why they were bringing immigrants to work to Arkansas is really the companies or their model of producing requires vulnerable people. Even the blacks or the white people that used to work in these jobs learned their value or not their value or not their rights. And this is not convenient for a company that wants to take advantage of workers or make themselves richer because of the exploitation of workers. So they require to bring vulnerable people, and those were the immigrants, right? So the immigrants, what I heard with the workers, some of the immigrants immigrated actually from California. Many of those workers were working on the fields in California before they moved to Arkansas. And they was word to mouth, right? Like families began moving to Arkansas and they found at home. Because a lot of these workers are from very small towns in Mexico, from villages in Mexico. And obviously, imagine comparing living in California with bigger cities than Arkansas. They found probably like a more related land that it was in Mexico. And that's how a lot of people, because the companies also were given back then, like we're talking about more than 20 years ago, like $50 in bonus if they brought a worker to come to work in this plant. So they were bringing like their family members, their friends, and that's how they began growing the immigrant community. Because also in comparison to live in California, where they had to split a house to be able to pay and afford the rent, they found like a cheaper cost of living here. They were able to find or to rent a home for themselves instead of sharing the home with multiple families, and also being able to buy actually their home. And so was more appealing for immigrants to live in Arkansas than to live in expensive state as California. But also there is a story, for example, Tyson has a story of smuggling illegally Mexicans to come to work to these plants. And people from Mexico, Central America began to move to these jobs because also they heard the stories of the families, that there were job opportunities. And this is how pretty much we have growing the immigrant population in Arkansas, that eventually there is other jobs now, like construction or hotel industry. But back then it was more of the poultry industry that brought these immigrants to Arkansas.
Let me pause here for a moment. The comment that Magaly just made about undocumented immigrants being brought into poultry plants isn't just something that you've heard whispered about. It's verifiable. You can Google it. In 2001, Tyson Foods and 6 of its managers were indicted by the federal government for allegedly smuggling undocumented workers across the border to work in their plants. The indictment detailed how workers were transported and how documents were allegedly falsified. By 2003, they were acquitted, but the investigation itself paints a clear picture of how far the system was willing to go to meet its labor demands. And that story, it's not from the distant past. That was from 2003. And it wasn't an isolated case either. There have been others, large raids at agri-processors in Iowa, Cope Foods in Mississippi, Operation Blooming Onion in Georgia, and accusations of worker abuse at JBS and Freshmark. Across the country and across industries, we've seen patterns where vulnerable people, often immigrants, are brought in to do the hardest jobs under the harshest conditions. These are hard stories to hear, but I wanted to pause and just confirm, because when Magaly first shared this with me, my first thought was certainly that couldn't be true. But as I looked into it deeper, these are verified court cases and verified occurrences. All right, let's get back to Magaly. Do you find that those that are working in these jobs today are the newer arrivals, probably from different countries than they came from to begin with, and maybe more vulnerable situations?
Now we are seeing that change. I think that there is workers having worked for Tyson or other companies for over 30 years or 40 years. And now those workers are getting retired. And this is a conversation that we've been having recently with workers, because they said, I don't know what these companies are going to do once this generation retires, and how they are bringing more workers to do the jobs. And this is something that we can discuss later on this conversation about what we are seeing right now and the answer to the lack of those, the lack of workers in this area to do those jobs. We can talk about more deep about that. But I think, yes, I think that right now we are seeing more of those workers who came more than 40 years ago to Arkansas, having worked for these companies for decades and now getting retired. It's something that is happening now. And actually, those workers, many of those workers were not able to find, because they got injured for life and they were not able to find another job. And they are now depending on the other family members to leave. But yeah, this is a situation that we are seeing now, the shift on new workers that are coming to Arkansas.
I think it would be helpful, maybe, could you explain a little bit about how these workers are placed in jobs, how that structure works of either workers being hired maybe by third parties that are hired by some of the poultry manufacturers, maybe not all jobs like that, but give us an understanding of how does that employment process work, to bring these workers to this space?
It's through different ways, right? Because, for example, there is workers that are hired directly by the company. Those workers are usually have a legal immigration status. Like, for example, Tyson hires a lot of those workers that have a TPS visa, a work permit, a resident, or even citizenship, that are workers, immigrants who have been in the U.S. for long and they were able to get their citizenship. And those workers are hired directly by the company. But we have other ways that they bring workers in. For example, there is companies like Georgie's that use temporary agencies. And so they get workers through those agencies to bring those workers. And it's a strategy the companies use to not check so much into the immigration status, because they pretty much let the sourcing company to deal with that. So they pretty much hired these agencies to bring workers, and they don't have to be held accountable if the workers don't have immigration status. And other ways, like, for example, with the cleaning workers, they also use third party where they bring workers to do the cleaning jobs. But also in the supply chain of all that industry, the workers who work in the chicken farms, like we call them the catchers, or they call themselves the catchers because they pretty much catch the bird, put them into the cages to transport them into the processing jobs, processing plants. And those workers are hired by the contractor that the companies hired them for. And this is a way that the companies have found a very successful model for themselves, right? Not for the workers, but for themselves, because they don't have any liability or responsibility over those workers who do a harder job. For example, the catchers are really, if you ask me, I will say that those workers are the most vulnerable workers within the supply chain, because those workers are mainly undocumented. And right now we are seeing, for example, in Arkansas, more natives from Guatemala immigrating to do these jobs, and also kids. We have seen a growing of kids doing these jobs. And they are hired by this contractor that is in charge to create groups of 6 workers to do those jobs in the chicken farms, but also going deeply about like how do these workers ended up. It's sometimes is word to mouth, but we are seeing maybe a path or ways of like human trafficking too, because sometimes these workers are being brought from other states like Georgia, Alabama to Arkansas, and then took them to other states like by season or so. So this is how these companies get rid of their liability to protect all the workers that are working to provide ultimately the meat that we see in our table every day.
Is that something you want to talk more about? I don't want to exploit that, though.
We don't have a lot of evidence on that because it's pretty. Going to the world of learning the stories to the catchers is a challenge itself, because those workers are so afraid to speak up. They are treated worse than the chicken that they're catching, really. And going deeper of connecting them, like the story, like right now I've been speaking with some kids that are working now in those farms, but it's like how the human trafficking happens is very not like clear. So there is not a lot of data or evidence that I can share on that. This is something that we suspect, and we want to do investigation more about how is that happening.
So when you think about just the working environment of a lot of these roles and jobs within the industry, and I realize there's a whole lot of them, what do we think about the environment of safety that exists for these employees? Certainly the companies would have a desire to have a safe work environment to obviously keep production moving and keep their workforce together, but where's that breakdown? Why are we not getting to where we need to get within those environments to provide those safe environments for those workers?
To be honest, I don't think that the companies care for the safety of the worker. Because if they would care, they would put in place ways that they would protect more of the workers. And I tell you this because I've been organizing with poultry workers for a little bit over 10 years. And I've been very connected to workers through all of these years and seeing how really the industry is moving to. And it's been always about how do they take advantage of the worker? How do they put the workers at higher risk in order for them to produce more? For instance, the line speed. The line speed has been an issue that we have fought for years. And we've been with testimonies of workers, with actual reports from the government that says this is putting in danger all of these workers because of the line speed issue. And yet they are still lobbying to increase the line speed. We saw that very clear with the pandemic. I think the pandemic really highlighted the stories of what the workers had been enduring for the years, and they made it worse during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it was a year that the workers were exposed to die to get sick and die in a very blunt way. And during that year of the 2020, where workers were struggling with COVID, with them getting sick, with them getting their families sick as well, the companies took the advantage of lobbying to the Trump administration and increased the line speed from 145 birds per minute to 174 birds per minute. And that happened in April of 2020. The USDA gave some waivers to some companies like Tyson, George's, Purdue, JBS, I believe, to increase to the line speed to some plants, right? So for people that don't know, they will show them like a service slip answer, like they are protecting the workers in this way, but in the reality, there is not of those practices really are put in place in the plants. And so this is why we've been very outspoken about how those systems or what they said that they have is not really the reality. And this is something that happened I believe it happened when the consumers were more concerned about how the animals were being killed, the exposure of how they were killing the animals, and the consumers were like, oh my gosh, what do you mean they're killing the chickens that way, the cows that way? I want more, how do they call them? Humane treatment to the animals. And that's how they began, because of the pressure of the animals and the environment, they began to create this corporate social responsibility model, where you could see, for example, in the website of Tyson, you go to sustainability and you see a very beautiful narrative about how they're taking care of the chickens and how they're taking care of the animals. But really, that is just PR for people. And that model is just for people to see it and then pretend that it's fine. But it's not really how things are running in the reality. So this is why Venceremos always challenge that model with the corporations. And a lot of corporations have this model, like sustainability models that are really for the people, consumers, to make them happy. But it's not really how things are running in the ground. And this is why we often challenge those practices, because that is not something that the workers have access to really the safety part of their jobs.
You've probably been asked this a lot, but I'm going to ask it just to give some context for maybe those that may not be familiar. During COVID, these were essential workers who were allowed to work during a time when really no one knew what was going on. And so, like in one vein, we see our society saying these are essential workers to all of us. But at the same time, there is, as you describe, there's not a level of care for their safety that should be there. How do we deal with the duality of this scenario? How do we think about this or hold these two stories in tension?
Yeah. In 2020, I mean, these workers have always been essential, because without their job, we wouldn't have food on the table. But in the 2020, the government and the companies took advantage of that to call them, they're essential to keep them work with not stop. It was really what they meant. You're going to be working with not stop, and you have to put yourself at risk, even to die, in order for us to keep running the food industry so people wouldn't be starving. Actually, Tyson called the workers heroes. They put a banner, and we are the heroes who are feeding the nation. But in reality, they were not treated as heroes, because when you talk about a hero or an essential people, you treat them with respect, with the due respect. We treat them nicely because you pay respect to that hero, right? But really, it was just a way to manipulate the media and the people to make them work harder. So with this idea, you're a hero, is pretty much you will expose yourself to die in order for others to live. And that's how we were fighting the narrative back then with Tyson. If you are calling them heroes, you need to treat them nicely. You need to give them the protections they need. You need to be sure that, because During the COVID, the workers were going to work every day with this anxiety, with the stress level super high, not knowing how many cases were happening at the plant, and began seeing the absenteeism of workers and not knowing why they were not coming to work. Was it because they took vacation time? Was it because they were sick of another thing? Was it because they quit the job? Was it because they had COVID? They were not informed whatsoever what was happening. And it was just pretty much them guessing or the rumors about, oh, that person got COVID. And then, oh, I was talking to that person yesterday. What is going to happen to me? And the company didn't inform the workers, you were exposed to this case. We need to put you in quarantine to decrease the levels of numbers. And they pretty much were going to work completely blind about what was happening and getting sick. They saw their coworkers dying eventually, and the company not even recognizing the death of the workers. There is this stories of the workers who have told me, Magaly, it was so heartbreaking to see that my coworker, who was next to me working for more than 10 years, more than 15 years, passed away. The company never acknowledged that death. And then when George Floyd was killed in that year, they made us pay a minute of silence for the death of George Floyd and never made us to pay any minute of silence for our own coworkers. So that is the level of how these companies were seeing these workers as expendable, as no human value whatsoever. They were not caring about those families, about what if me exposing these workers, I'm not going to expose him to die, but I might expose her husband or wife or kids to die. And we were like mobilizing the community, mobilizing the workers, because the workers in that year, it was the moment that the workers were more afraid of dying than losing their jobs. And that's why we were mobilizing constantly. Every month we had an action. Every month we were having something, because it was alarming to see the number of cases of people who were getting sick and the numbers of people who were dying, and nobody was recognizing those people, those essential workers and the heroes.
As we are here today, COVID has passed to some extent. Is there anything else you want to say about that time in COVID? Not that you have to, but I don't want to move on too fast if there are.
I could say that obviously COVID was a crucial point for what we are seeing right now. Because for me, it's been 5 years, right? For everybody, it has been 5 years. But for me, we're still having the side effects of what happened in 2020. And I said this because the situation got worse. And there is before COVID and after COVID. And I said this because we began seeing a decrease of number of workers working at the plant, and how the company took advantage of that situation to learn, instead of having 10 workers on the line, actually 8 workers, 6 workers are able to produce that fast. And they didn't even make an effort to bring more workers, because this is something that, because I've seen and lived these stories with the workers. In 2020, Tyson made even more profits than they made before. I think it was, I don't want to be so accurate, but I'm not sure if I'm too accurate, but it was around 2-3 billion that they did more than the past years. So they set the bar too high of profits. So eventually, the next coming years, they had to increase those profits. And so they increased the price of meat, right? But they cannot increase the price of the chicken too high. So what happened is, okay, can we make more profits out of the situation and the inflation and the crisis and everything going on? Was to learn that actually having less workers to produce was a way to save on wages. And then eventually it was in 2023 when they fired their old CEO because they were in red numbers. Tyson went on a crisis for some years. Actually, there is some news about it, about like how they were not really very happy with their profits in 2021, 2022. They brought this new CEO, Donnie King. And when he became the CEO of Tyson, we began seeing like they started to shut down plants, for example, in Van Buren, in Virginia, in Noel, Missouri. It was because they also probably learned that production could be allocated to other plants and to not expend so much money in the plants that were not having a lot of production or contracts. And so they placed that production to other plants, and the workers saw an increase of a job or production with less workers. So you cannot believe if I'm telling you that in 2013, when I began hearing the stories of poultry workers and how injured they were, the numbers tripled by now of how many workers are injured for life. A lot of workers are doing the job with one hand because the other is completely injured. And a lot of workers are not even given the right treatment to do their job. A lot of workers are afraid of losing that job and then not be able to find another job because of those injuries. So it is pretty alarming to see the high number of workers who are injured and working while injured to produce the food that we have. So yes, I think that COVID was this momentum in where everything became worse and worse by the year. And now it is completely unsustainable of how these companies are running. And the answer has always been, how do we bring more vulnerable workers? And that goes to the new Trump administration, what he's doing to the immigrants and all of that.
I never thought about COVID actually being a way of showing how they could make more money. I hadn't thought about it in the way that you laid that out. Explain to me, maybe if you can, what does healthcare look like when someone is injured? What are their options? How are they treated? Where can they go to hopefully recover and be given the care that they need to continue with their life and hopefully remain in either the jobs that they were if they want to? But what does healthcare look like for this?
It looks pretty terrifying because when the workers get injured, for example, companies like Tyson has the zero tolerance to injury, so zero record on injury, something like that. But what that means is really they are not reporting the injuries. They are committed to zero injury. Yes, because they are not reporting them. When a worker gets injured, and it's often through repetitive motion, and they develop carpal tunnel syndrome, or they get cuts or amputation, but that is a higher injury, like a worse injury. But for example, with the carpal tunnel syndrome issue that they develop by processing and doing the repetitive motion, imagine like in the deboning department, they are processing between 40 to 45 birds per minute. So that means that they have to cut around 40 to 45 birds at the moment, like the legs, the wings, the breast. And so they developed carpal tunnel syndrome pretty quickly because of that repetitive motion. Then the workers began having symptoms like their hands get numbed, they cannot hold heavy stuff anymore. And they go to the nurse station because all of the poultry plants have a nurse station. And people that don't know how they function, they could say, oh, at least they have a doctor there, right? But those doctors are hired by the company and they are paid by the company. And their job is to pretty much benefit the company and not the workers. And so there is a lot of negligence going on those nurse stations because the nurse will just tell the worker, oh, you don't have anything, just take this Tylenol and go back to work. And that's how they keep workers on Tylenol for years. And for example, when the worker needs a surgery, the company works with certain doctors and they are sent to see these doctors. You cannot believe the stories of what goes around that. I cannot even believe how a doctor has the heart to not really do what a doctor should do, is to care for the health of the patient. And so all of these doctors that are connected to these companies will often, like, for example, if the worker gets a surgery on a Friday, the doctor will tell them, okay, you're ready to work on Monday. And they are sent back to work on Monday without being able to completely recover. And they often have to work with one hand or to find an easy job while they are recovering. But if they have pain, if they need something, or the pills get them dizzy or sleepy, they have to cope up with that, because there is not like you can go home and relax and take care of yourself. It's not. It's just like you have to be here inside. You have to stay here. Otherwise, we're going to put you a point. And these companies have disciplinary point systems where if the worker reaches up to 14 points, they get fired. So obviously the workers don't want to get these points, because often they use them, for example, if they have to go to the school because of their kids, they will say, okay, I will miss my job because I have to go to the school for my kid. I will get 1 point, because that's an urgency for the parents. And often when it's about their own health, they don't want to earn points because they've been accumulating certain points that they don't want to lose the job. So this is how they keep them trapped into working while injured. And there is we sometimes with the cases that we hope is once you get injured, you have to get a lawyer. But there is not enough lawyers here that will take those cases. We recommend, if I will be honest, a 3 list of lawyers that we know they would take those cases. And sometimes the lawyers have fought with Tyson and to say, we have to change the doctor, because the doctor that is your doctor that is working with the company is not really diagnosing the workers with the right thing. And they need a second opinion. And that's how, through a lawyer, they are forced to change the doctor. But if the worker don't have a lawyer, they will get stuck with the company's doctor and whatever the doctor is determined. Imagine that I have a case for a worker who was exposed to a chemical accident in the Tyson plant in 2011. Still, she is dealing with that chemical accident. And she developed asthma, she developed a lot of respiratory problems, that in 2017, when I told her, you need to hire a lawyer because you cannot be only with these treatments and the company not really compensating you for that injury. She went with the lawyer, and she found out that the doctor was not really giving her the diagnosis. And when the doctor wrote a letter to the attorney, he said, knowing that this worker became a patient of him because of that accident, he dared to write a letter to the workers' comp to say that injury is not because of work-related, is not a work-related injury. And he was like, oh my God, we need to have a second opinion. And we fought really hard to change that doctor, because that doctor was pretty much screwing the case of the worker. We had to get a second opinion, and the second doctor said, yes, this problem began when that accident happened at this plant. And I'm talking about one case. There's like hundreds of those cases where workers don't get the right compensation or the right treatment. And it's because everything is the company controls the doctors, controls the lawyers. And it's something that it's heavy. It's very hard to fight for justice when all these people are in complicity of this company because of money.
Magaly, thank you. I think it brings us into where we are today and maybe the work that you are doing. Explain to me, you're here, you're not creating a union, if I understand correctly. You're here about organizing the workers to speak for themselves. I would love to maybe explain that difference to us a little bit and why you feel like that's the pathway forward to.
Yeah, as I said, for me, since the beginning of organizing poultry workers has been to find the right solution. Because we want to see changes, we want to see justice, we want to see that workers have dignity on doing those jobs. And me working for 10 years on this, and then in this journey also learning how to organize these workers, what are the current solutions? We are in a right to work state, which is Arkansas. And we are also in a corporate state. The state is running by corporations, and the corporations like Walmart and Tyson have a lot of power in the laws that we have in the state. Also, the labor rights in the South are pretty weak, and the unions in the South are pretty weak because of the right to work state laws. And since the beginning, when I was working, I was connecting with the unions and then learning that the unions didn't want to expand the unions to other plants because among the meat processing, the poultry plants are the less unionized. I think it's only 30% of the plants are unionized. And it has been because they pretty much adopted the plans when they were already have unions. But ever since the companies or the industry has grown, there is no more efforts to unionize more plants because of the union don't want to lose what they have won already. They don't want to put in risk the contracts they already have. That is just the truth. And me, at the beginning of my efforts of organizing, obviously we focus a lot of OSHA on teaching the workers about the rights on OSHA, on how to file a complaint through OSHA, and if they had a discrimination or a sexual harassment case, they will file the cases through the EEOC. And if they had a problem with wage theft, we will file in a case with the Department of Labor. But then actually I learned first of all, that the workers didn't trust OSHA because they said, whenever I talked with the workers and said, we can file a claim through OSHA, and they will say, no, Magaly, OSHA doesn't do anything. When OSHA comes to the plant, they already notified the plant, so the plant makes sure that when OSHA is coming to visit us, everything is clean, is low, everything is staged for OSHA. So OSHA won't do anything, Magaly. They will tell me straightforward. And then with the cases of discrimination and harassment, the laws are very narrow and very ambiguous that it's very hard to really see a successful case coming out of those agencies. And I found myself me as a leader and organizer, I cannot bring solution to workers that I know that are really not working, those solutions, right? Those solutions are not really the solutions. And for me, it is important to earn the trust of the workers. Because if I imagine me as an organizer and I bring the solution that they, first of all, don't trust, and that the solution is not really doing anything, they will tell me, Magaly, lose the trust in me, right? And that's when in 2019, I traveled with a group of workers and myself to Florida to learn about the farm workers in Florida and the model that they established. And when we learned that they also had this journey of finding solutions, that at the end, they ended up creating a powerful model to organize and to bring changes, it was the moment that the workers and me were like, we need to follow that model. And I think that's what I also talk about when organizing. We really need to humble ourselves and learn from others. And what is the best way to learn about what the farm workers have done for decades? because the farm workers are very vulnerable. They are exempt from laws like organizing laws, right? They don't have the right to organize. They are very vulnerable workers in the labor laws in the US. And yet they've been very successful about creating either their own independent unions, like we have seen in California or even Washington State. And the workers in the farm workers in Florida created this model that is called the worker-driven social responsibility model. And this is the counterpart model of what the model that I talked before, the corporate social responsibility that don't have teeth. That model is just a PR for people, beautiful web page that they talk. But what the Coalition of Immokalee Workers created was the worker-driven social responsibility model. That is basically that the workers created their own code of conduct. They brought it to the supply chain, to the corporate companies atop those companies, to force them to adopt this like a standard. The same way as McDonald's will say, I'm not going to buy the chicken because it has antibiotics, or I'm not going to buy a chicken that has been killed with cruelty. The same way that they can set standards for the workers' rights. And this is how Venceremos was born, with the idea of duplicating that model to the poultry industry, so that eventually we create a code of conduct written by workers, and that we can go to the corporations atop these companies and force them to set a standard of how they should buy their products with the dignity of the workers.
Are you finding that is effective?
Obviously, it's challenging, right? Because it's a bigger industry than the tomatoes. And this model has been adopted to the dairy industry in Vermont. It's challenging also to bring workers together. But we're moving forward. I think for us, establishing Venceremos itself was a challenge. Now we are going to be 5 years, or we're going to be 6 years this year. And it still is a growing organization, right? But we are moving forward to adopt that, and we're working on creating that.
Maybe speak a little bit to the hesitancy of workers wanting to speak up for themselves, and why this kind of advocacy work that you're doing is so necessary.
The model in Florida, obviously, if we create that model, it will have a faster mechanism to solve the problems and more protections, because the rights of the workers will be reinforced through the market. Either if we make corporations like McDonald's, Burger King, Chick-fil-A, Walmart to adopt our code of conduct, then obviously they will be protected by retaliation. So we will need to create another third organization that will monitor the companies to the implementation of a code of conduct. And the powerful part of this model is that it creates legal binding agreements between the corporations and Venceremos, for example. With these legal binding agreements, there's risk if they don't comply, right? So they are in the risk of losing the contracts of those corporations. And precisely is that the companies don't want to lose those contracts. So this is a way to grab them in that power, right? And to force them to respect the dignity and the human rights of the workers. So obviously, before we implement such model, which is very ambitious model, right now, obviously, the workers are pretty afraid to speak up because there is not protections. And particularly, Mike, in this town, is not only the retaliation of the company, it's also the retaliation of the society. Because in the society here in the Northwest Arkansas, there is a huge respect for the company, because they have this idea of they are creating jobs. They are bringing charity. If we have a tornado, these companies will give us chicken, right? And so when the workers speak up, often they hear like, why are you biting the hand that is feeding you? Even in the churches, like they get charities from these companies, and even the pastor will discourage workers to organize or to speak up. So it's not only they are afraid of like the company itself, it's they're afraid of the retaliation, how they're perceived in the community by sharing or speaking up those stories, that often if the pastor will hear the stories, will silence them, and if that story doesn't go anywhere. This is why Venceremos has been really powerful, because I've done a lot of work of really handing the microphone to workers to expose the stories. Because yes, I can share the stories and it can be impactful, but when a worker shares the story, it's even way more impactful because they are sharing their own story. And people really need to listen to those stories.
Maybe talk a little bit more about maybe this community response. The series of our conversations is really about how do we as a community create a community that where everyone is welcome and where everyone is included. And this feels like a part of our community that may not feel like they belong or doesn't feel like they are included. And I'd love to understand, like, how is that community response either perpetuating that feeling of not belonging or isolation, or do you see pockets where the community is engaging and creating bridges to try to include this part of our community into the broader narrative of what a great Northwest Arkansas looks like?
I think that is changing a little bit. When I was organizing 10 years ago, it was completely a taboo to speak about the poultry workers. Actually, I was not invited to a lot of tables of conversations because they saw me pretty radical, and that was something that nobody wanted to touch on. I think through the work that we've done to exposing the stories and how brave we've been and the recognition we have nationwide and how we are motivating or inspiring artists or writers to write books or to write stories about us has helped a lot to that the community here is accepting more these conversations. And obviously, there is still a lot of room to improve, but it's really this idea of we are not telling that we should destroy Tyson, right? In the larger picture, this company should not be running the way that they run because it's really not sustainable. And we can talk more about that, but probably it's not this time. But in reality, it's not like we're telling Dyson to shut down the plants and operations, because we know that is not going to be possible because people love Chick-fil-A, people love Burger King, people love McDonald's, right? This is not the job of Venceremos. We are not about that. We are about like any job that these workers have should have dignity and respect. And so I think the community right now, they accept more to at least hear or learn. We have seen more interest in the last 5 years of people wanting to learn more about what is happening with the immigrant workers and why Venceremos is very recognized outside Arkansas. And so, yeah, people are more perceptive or more open to receive the information, even with foundations, or now I'm invited to more events than before, even to the University of Arkansas that before was a no-no, Magaly, right? And now even the University of Arkansas are putting themselves in that risk, right? Because at the end of the day, these stories are important because it's not what we want the community is that they should tell Tyson, you are a family-owned business. You're a Christian business, right? You claim yourself to be Christian value, family values. So when it comes to the immigrants, then there is no values on those families. There is not Christian values to respect those families. So this is why this year, actually, we created this march to recognize the presence of these workers or these immigrants here in the community. that people should recognize their presence or what they bring to these communities, because it's often that the community, white community, other communities value our food, our culture, but they don't value us as people. And it's a time to really reflect who we are as a community and what do we own to each other, which is respect and value. And yeah, I think little by little that is changing. People are being forced to change. And I think people should be forced to change because right now with the crisis on humanity, not only in the US, but and worldwide, I think we should enter to a phase of really considering what is really valuable and what is not, what should be looking into be more humane, right? Because we have seen the worst already. And to acknowledge that Tyson has a lot of power to change that, but they also have this mentality, this karma mentality of I need to exploit and treat workers with zero indignity in order for me to get profits, because it's the legacy of slavery in this country. We need to break through that legacy and understanding that in order to have profits, we should not exploit workers. And that actually will work happily. It should be, they will last more working in these jobs. But the need of money and profits over people is not leading us to anywhere, but to the catastrophe, really.
That is a very powerful word. And I think it bridges a little bit to where we are today. We've seen a pretty big shift nationally in our national dialogue around subjects of immigration, especially with undocumented people. This is an industry that is not immune from being the target of that dialogue. Where are we today? What has the recent national or state or even regional conversations, how is that changing the work that you're doing? How is that changing the workers that are here in our community and their sense of belonging?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question, because right now, after the 5 years of COVID, we have the same president. In 2020, we were dealing with Trump. That actually Trump was the one that called the essential workers, right? And then after 5 years, now they're being persecuted and called criminals. He forgot about the essential workers. He forgot about that these workers put themselves at risk in order to provide food, in order to provide the services that we needed back then. So now this is something very interesting, Mike, because I think that what we are seeing now is, or the response of the people and people supporting something that it really doesn't have any sense to support, is really talks about the lack of understanding, the ignorance of knowing really how the economic system works in the US. Because what I've shared with you before is a company or an industry that often is seeking more profit every year to the cost of anything. So obviously, when we talk about, or when Trump uses this phrase of they're taking our jobs, and people really replicating that thought, like they're taking our jobs. Is it really they're taking their jobs? Is it really the jobs that I was describing just now? You want those jobs? It's not that the people are taking on your jobs. It's the bad conditions that are displacing you. The bad working conditions are displacing people that know about the rights. Because these companies don't care about hiring people that know about the rights and dignity. Because there is no way that these companies will function with that. Because they only care for profit. So it's not the immigrants that are taking on your jobs. It's the bad working conditions that are displacing you. So we need to tackle that situation and how these companies are running to the expense of whom. And yeah, right now we are seeing this narrative about we are deporting all these criminal immigrants. And putting these immigrants that are really going to work afraid every day now with the immigration threat is like they are making these workers more vulnerable, right? These workers are not going to be able to speak. Now we're seeing that. It's harder to speak with the workers because they are afraid of losing the jobs, because also the employers are using that to intimidate the workers. And let's suppose this is a scenario, right, where they deport all these people. There is no way that the white working class is going to take on these jobs. The white working class is mad at the wrong person. They are mad really because their economic system that they built displays them. Because what they believed it was working before is not working anymore for them. Because under capitalism, you need to create profits and profit to the expense of anything. And they embraced this system as the system that they believed in because they were against other value or other systems or whatever. But they embraced this system that eventually displaced them because they were not useful anymore for this system that is often taking advantage of people. So right now, yes, they can deport the immigrants, but who is going to come to do these jobs? And this is why in the march that we did in March 2 months ago, it was about sending the message to people that there is no way that the white people are going to return to these jobs, is that they are going to find a way to bring vulnerable workers from other countries with this idea of we are providing visas to these workers. And actually, soon after we did the march, Trump began talking more about the expansion of the temporary visas. Mm-hmm. And people don't know probably what they are, and I can explain a little bit of what they are. Since the first Trump administration, he increased tremendously the temporary visas that are called guest worker visas. These are called H-2A and H-2B visas. With the H-2A, they brought a lot of agricultural workers to work in the fields of Florida, California, and other parts of the state. With these guest worker visas, the workers come with a 6-month contract that the companies will create to bring these workers. And we have seen tons of cases of the human violations that occur with these workers. Why? Because people that, for example, Trump talks about, we need the legal immigrants, right? We don't want the illegal, but we need the legal. What he means is he's training their audience. He's training his people and supporters to believe that now, guess what? We deported the bad guys, but we're bringing them legally. And by bringing them legally, we have more control in how we are going to exploit them. And we still, white people, poor white people, you're still going to be out of the equation. That is something that he's not telling to his audience, but that's really what it is. You white poor people are still going to be out of the equation because you are displaced by this system already. So you pay attention only, we wanted to pay attention only about the legality or illegality of the people because we want you to keep distracted from the real issue, right? So by them training them already, like we're going to bring the legal people is really, we are going to bring the new way to exploit people, which we call the new modern day slavery, right? Because it's legal, it's modern, but it's still slavery. Why? Because we have seen tons of cases of human rights violations under these guest worker visas, because workers will come for 6 months. The employer will treat them so badly that they are not going to be able to speak up because they will be afraid of losing the benefit of going back to their country and the benefit of coming back to work for 6 months. So those workers will be very hard and are very hard to organize. And we also have seen in 2021, actually, the Department of Labor unveiled one of the largest cases of human trafficking. It was like more than 80,000 workers who were trafficked to work in the fields of Georgia. with these guest worker visas because they were pretty much recruiting people from South Mexico and to tell them, we are going to bring you to work in the US for 6 months, but you have to pay the paperwork and you have to pay. So they pretty much brought them and they were making them pay every week. They were paying them $50 a week per week because the rest was going to pay for the paperwork they created to bring them back. But it was just really a way to enslave them, a way to take advantage of their wages. And so they actually jailed a lot of those people who were involved in that case. And we recently, last year, we helped a case of 3 workers who were brought with a H-2B visa. The H-2B visa are for construction and manufacturing. They are not for processing. Trump tried to expand that for processing in his last year of his last term, but he didn't pass it. So he probably was not time for that. So it was not an expansion. So what they did now was that with this case of the 3 workers that we helped them was that they were hired through a sourcing company in Guatemala that told them, we are going to have this contract to work in Chicago for a construction company. Once they arrived to Chicago, they found out the sourcing company called them like, guess what? The company is no longer going to need you, but don't worry, we have another job for you, which is in Huntsville, Arkansas. Take a plane to travel to Huntsville, Arkansas, and there is a job waiting for you, which was a turkey plant that they were brought in. Obviously, it was a violation of the contract and violation of the guest worker visas. And what I want to say is that these guest worker visas have a lot of room to exploit the workers, to take advantage of workers, and to continue this cycle of really screwing of the dignity of the immigrants that are coming to do these jobs.
The picture you paint is, I've never heard anyone speak of this in this way before.
Yeah, because people get distracted a lot. And then Trump is very good about keeping us so full with information and you don't know anything else. But me doing this job and seeing, like, there is no way that a worker that knows the language, that knows the rights, are going to do these jobs. And these jobs are getting worse by day. So, yeah, they have to bring now immigrant workers with this legal status to please the white people and to please the companies and to really continue exploiting the communities in that name.
You mentioned this earlier about what does the sourcing of new labor look like to Northwest Arkansas within this industry? How is that shaping or evolving or changing? What does that look like today?
Yes. In the past years, and actually it was before the COVID, it was a time when we were thinking, like, how are they going to bring more people to work in these jobs? And we began seeing more refugees coming to Arkansas. Actually, there is an organization that focuses on bringing the refugees. And to me, it was like, oh no, now they're bringing the refugees to work in these jobs. Because obviously you're not bringing them to a state that has a strong labor laws, or it's not like Arkansas suddenly is pro-refugees and they so care about refugees because the state of Arkansas don't really care about immigrants or refugees. But they brought them here because that meant an opportunity for these companies to hire those people. So eventually we saw more refugees coming to the state of Arkansas that they were put into those jobs. But then after the COVID, with all the situation that happened in COVID, the workers who died, the workers who were no longer be able to work, with the absenteeism of workers, we saw the answer to the crisis to bring kids to the state. So we saw the governor actually allowing kids to work with any permit of their parents. And people will ask, so what? Yes, it was important that because a lot of the kids that are coming to work in the chicken farms are unaccompanied kids. They cross the border by themselves, and their parents are back in Guatemala or other countries. And so now these companies are recruiting these kids to work there.
And these are people that are under 18 years old. When
Yes.
you say kids, I'm just trying to understand like an age range.
I've met with the kids that were 14 years old 2 years ago that were working in the chicken farms. And people or Tyson or these companies will say that they are agricultural kids. Do you know that the U.S., in the labor laws in the U.S., is completely legal to hire a kid to work in the fields because they don't have any protections? But in the chicken farms are not considered agricultural. They are not in that category. So this is why we keep claiming that, yes, there is kids, minors working on those jobs. And those are not like easy jobs. It's not like a kid is working distributing ice cream or selling ice cream or serving drinks at McDonald's. It's like those kids. Actually, last Friday, I traveled to Ceylon to meet with some of them. And this kid, he's now 17, but he began working when he was 15 years old. And now with the contractor that they were working, they were pretty much uploading per week between 200,000 to 300,000 birds per a group of 6 people. I saw their hands and they cannot even close their hands anymore. And it was like, and I had to speak with the kids because he didn't want to speak up and he didn't want to do anything because the contractor didn't want to pay their wages back. And he was very afraid of coming forward. And I had to speak with him and said, your hands right now are getting destroyed after working on those jobs for a year and a half. When you're 21, there is no way that you will find another job doing this every day. Like his uncle, he has his hands, he cannot even close them. And he has worked for 4 years. So it was like this time of, what are we doing to protect the kids that are coming to Arkansas? Why is it like there is a crisis on the kids and nobody's talking about this? Not only in Arkansas, but really worldwide. We are attacking kids left and right, and nobody is really alarming on giving more protection to these kids. Because these kids now can be 13, 14, 15, but tomorrow they're going to be 40, right? 50. What humans are we raising for tomorrow if we are not really caring for what is happening to them right now?
One thing that those listening would not be able to know is Magaly just showed me a picture of the hands that she was referring to, and it's hard to look at. It's very hard to see, but thank you for sharing that with me. Brings, into reality. I won't forget that image. It's very hard. What's the way forward? What would you ask?
Yeah, we will continue, obviously, advocating for workers and organizing workers, educating workers in the community, because we really need to change the narratives in the community in order for the workers to have or to feel that they are more empowered to speak up. We really need to bring the consciousness. Our work has to do a lot about consciousness. Because without consciousness, you cannot do a really change. You really need to be conscious about the food that we buy and what is behind the food that we buy. We need to be more proactive in demanding the rights of the people that are producing the food that we consume. And on the part of the workers, we also have a lot of work to do to heal the division that exists. Because obviously these companies work really hard to divide workers, and that the workers have this idea that certain groups of workers are better treated than others. And so we do that through popular education, through art, through theater, through paintings, and we travel, we do a lot of canvassing work. And what we really need to develop is an ongoing campaign that is tackling the supply chain of these companies. But in order to do that, we need a base of supporters too. We need people that are constantly supporting the efforts of Venceremos, contributing to Venceremos' work. And with the workers, obviously, is to to bring more workers because we never act without the input of workers. It's never like Magaly wants to do this because she just has a brilliant mind and wants to do it. No, I always have to be mindful on where the workers are, how to meet them where they are, and to encourage them to get out of that situation. And that often it's a process. But we cannot do this as an organization that only counts on numbers. We never care about, oh, we need to distribute 1,000 flyers and then I have the numbers to write in a grant. That's not how we operate. We operate with this idea that we are people, we are humans. And it's not about the numbers, but the quality of the work that we do, because it's not easy to bring a worker from point A, where they are so afraid to speak up, to a point B, where they are encouraged to continue organizing and to bring more workers in.
What would you ask of the community of Northwest Arkansas?
I will ask them to be open, to really learn the reality of what these immigrants are going through and the value of the immigrants in our community, to stop accusing each other or attacking each other. We need to unite. We need to understand that we need each other, that we as humans, we wouldn't survive without the other, and that these immigrants have built a house, a home in Arkansas, and they are part of the society. They are part of the community. And we need to recognize them as people, not just as workers. Or even if they recognize as workers, they should recognize that without their job, we wouldn't have food in our table. And we need to be more humane when we see our neighbor, that the hate situation is not going to take us anywhere, because they are also suffering the consequences of a system that have displaced them. And we really need to recognize what we really need to do together in order to change these companies' practices, because the companies really have to understand that in order to get a profit, they should not put workers or people at risk of losing their hands, having a struggle with their own health and dignity, really. So I will invite all the audience to be part of Venceremos, to learn about what we do, to learn about the stories of the workers, because this is not only the fight of the workers, this should be the fight of all of us that don't want these practices to stay as a practice that we recognize, right? This should be a way to break through and to change that in order to be a better human beings tomorrow.
I try to finish every conversation with two questions. One is around your fears within the work that you do. When I say that, I'm curious what comes to mind. What are your fears in this place?
The only fear that I have is that we don't get to see the changes that we want to see. It's not like I'm constantly afraid of that, but I'm always aware of what we need to do to keep growing and keep moving forward. We don't work on fear, on organizing, because I think that's always been our identity. We are not afraid of these companies. We're not afraid of the work that we do, but we're just afraid of like people, especially in the ally community. We don't get enough support that we need to keep moving forward. We are still going to be very determined to go forward anyway, but it will be a tremendous change if that shift happens.
One of the concepts that string all of these conversations is this idea of community wholeness. And so I'm curious, when I say that to you, what does that mean? What is that idea of wholeness where maybe everything is as it should be?
Yeah, I think that talking about labor or poultry workers should not be stigmatized. We should be more comfortable of speaking the truth about what is happening, we should be more open to hear the stories of others, to not silence them or gaslighting them. I think that the perfect situation should be where workers also know about the rights and the people work hard to reinforce those rights, and that we have a sustainability in the meat industry, that these companies truly care about the workers, truly care about the animals, and truly care about the environment. And that should be a perfect way to be, where there is not always going to be perfect, but at least to have the mechanisms to make the perfect, or to correct them, right? Or to prevent problems that all of these issues that I've been talking are preventable. And so, yeah, I think that should be where we should be more open of learning the real stories that happen with the immigrants or vulnerable people. What is our part on changing that, and be more proactive on changing.
Magaly, thank you for your time and for sharing a table to listen to you. And I think it reveals a reality that we often here in this community don't have to reckon with. And so I want to thank you for speaking from your experiences, speaking on behalf of those who don't have the opportunity to sit in front of a microphone like this. And Magaly, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for seeking out that idea of dignity in every human being that's in our community. I'm deeply thankful for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Well, an incredible thank you to Magaly for joining us, for her clarity, her persistence, and for helping us listen more closely to the stories that are often left out of our region's narrative. We began the season with a commitment to seek an honest history of Northwest Arkansas. That means telling the stories that are celebrated, but also the ones that are hidden, buried, or too uncomfortable to name. Magaly's voice reminds us that the labor shaping this place is not just economic, it's human, it's personal, and it's ongoing. Poultry workers, many of them immigrants, are not outside of our community. They are our community. They live in our neighborhoods, they raise their children here, and make it possible for many of the comforts and conveniences that we enjoy to exist. And yet their presence is often unseen, their voices often go unheard, and their dignity often goes unprotected. If the underview is about shaping of our place, then we must ask, what does it mean to belong to Northwest Arkansas? What kind of community are we building when the people who sustain it are not part of the stories that we tell about it? These questions aren't accusations, they're invitations to think more deeply, to see more clearly, and to hold ourselves accountable to a vision of a community that doesn't depend on silence or separation to function. We can't claim to care about the future of this place if we aren't willing to look at how it's built. And we can't say everyone belongs here if we aren't willing to confront the systems that keep belonging out of the reach for so many. In our next episode, we're going to continue exploring the questions of identity, migration, and memory that shape how different communities experience this place. Because understanding where we're going begins by fully seeing who we've always depended on to get there. I want to say thank you for listening, and I want to say thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.